Now, the barbecue may not be as good as what he can get near his hometown of Union City, Tennessee. After all, Memphis is not that far away. However, USDA Deputy Secretary Stephen Vaden believes that Washington, D.C. is the place where he needs to be right now, even as he helps lead a plan to get some of the staff he oversees out of D.C. Hi, I'm Dave Price. The Deputy Secretary is working on a plan that would shift an already downsized USDA staff into 5 regional hubs. Those would be in Raleigh, North Carolina, Kansas City, Missouri, another good barbecue place, Indianapolis, Indiana, Fort Collins, Colorado, and Salt Lake City, Utah. In our conversation this week, he explains how that process would work, and he addresses the critics about whether everybody can still expect the access to USDA services that they've come to expect in the past. Let's begin our conversation with how he stays connected back home. Well, we appreciate you joining us. I wonder if you talk a little bit about growing up, and then we'll eventually get to how you ended up getting into ag.
Well, I grew up in a small town called Union City, Tennessee. It's right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border in the northwest corner of the state. And so my father was, among other things, a farmer. And he owns, now I own, my brother and I do, farmland in both of Vaden County, Tennessee and Fulton County, Kentucky. The farmland in Fulton County has been in our family for, at this point, basically 200 years. It predates the Kentucky State Legislature's establishment of the county in which it sits, as a matter of fact. We learned that, fun fact, doing some deed work following my father's passing. So our roots run deep in that part of the country. It's not a part of the state of Tennessee that's particularly well known. We're very rural. We're 2 hours, more than 2 hours north of Memphis. And we abut rural sections of Kentucky, as well as Arkansas and Missouri. So we're kind of out there in our own world, but I enjoy it. It's a great place that I return to most weekends to get away from the hurly-burly of the city and to be in a location where, present company excluded, I don't have to worry about running into journalists.
Exactly. And does it give you the excuse to your bosses where you're like, hey, we don't have cell service out here?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. My background is obviously as a lawyer.
Yeah.
And when I first started the practice of law here in Washington, D.C., the firm for which I worked, Patton Boggs, had T-Mobile as its provider. It was back in the days of your BlackBerry.
Yeah.
And when I would get roughly about 30 minutes north of Memphis, Tennessee, T-Mobile didn't have service. So when I went home on the weekend, basically from about an hour or so, taking an airport time after I landed, until I was within 30 minutes range of Memphis, Tennessee, I didn't have service on my BlackBerry, so it wasn't a good benefit. They've improved their service.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Work, but it was a nice respite, even from that, in the first couple of years of my law practice.
What are you growing on the farm?
We are, even though we're Southern, we're more Midwestern in scope in my region of Tennessee, so it's corn and soy. We will sometimes do wheat, but it's primarily corn and soy, which comes in really handy for the issues that take up much of our time here at USDA.
Sure.
Other than personally, no one has to explain the market dynamics to me.
What's this like for you and your brother? Do you feel, is there a sense of pressure to make sure this thing's working since it's been in the family for so many years, or do you not look at it that way?
I don't necessarily look at it quite that way. I don't see it as a pressure. I prefer to see it more as a duty. Our father passed down, not just farms, but local rental properties and other things to us. And I see a duty to keep that going while also building on top of it. And my way of building on top of it is the practice of law. And I guess some people might say at least a slight amount of practice of politics in my current role. My father never was a lawyer. My mother hated lawyers. So it's somewhat ironic that I have become one.
Well, she couldn't have hated all lawyers. There had to be at least one she loved.
Well, theoretically, I would be that one, but it is true to say, and I've said this in public remarks, that my mother hated two groups of people, lawyers and politicians.
Oh
So,
no.
so of course, she gave birth to a son who became a lawyer who represented politicians. So,
A true test of a mother's love. Okay, so talk about this new gig. Now, you also worked in the first Trump administration, but in this current role, what do you feel is your biggest duty? And I appreciate you're not even a year into this yet, but what kind of the day to day, what do you really see as your biggest vision, your biggest goal?
Well, you're correct. I served as general counsel for all 4 years of President Trump's first term, and that's an enormous advantage in my current role as deputy secretary, because both of those roles involve um, dealings with the entire department. For most of our officials here at USDA, even if you're an undersecretary, you're only dealing with a part of the department. So when you look overall at the department, it's basically the secretary, the deputy secretary, and the general counsel are the three key officers that have to deal with everybody. And it really is a large and varied department. We have 8 undersecretaries. That is an enormous amount when you look at most cabinet departments. We have that many different issue areas. And so my role as deputy secretary is to be here on a day-to-day basis more often than the secretary can be because of her aggressive travel schedule out delivering the message for the president to rural America, and to see to it on a day-to-day basis that the president and the secretary's policy initiatives are carried out and implemented, and also to serve as the chief operating officer of the department and make certain all the day-to-day affairs that any organization needs in order to be successful are humming along too. Then, of course, the secretary has delegated to me the authority and the ability to run her reorganization plan. And so that is taking up quite a bit of my time as we prepare to shrink our footprint here in Washington, D.C., and expand the number of people that we have across the country. Because as you know, there's not a lot of rural here in Washington, D.C. We serve rural America, and so we need to have nearly all of our people out closer to rural America than they're going to be here in the District of Columbia.
And if you can talk about that reorg plan now, so you're going to look at 5 regional hubs rather than having so much I mean, you're spread all over the country now, but so that you don't have so much primarily focused in DC. How does that get carried out? That's a big task.
Our goal is to have roughly around 2,000 people left in Washington, D.C. at the end of this. Currently, we have a sprawling geographic footprint here in Washington, D.C. The building immediately behind me, the South Building, until the construction of the Pentagon, it was the largest office building in this country, believe it or not. That building, on its busiest day, that's a building that can hold well more than 7,000 people if every office currently in it was occupied, has never even reached the 40% occupancy rate. And that building needs, in and of itself, $1 billion in backlog maintenance. Now, most of your listeners are in the private economy. They're probably pulling their hair out at this point because long before they ever reached a situation like that, they would have made the smart business decision to sell the real estate asset that they didn't need and deploy that capital some other way. And that's what we're going to end up doing here at USDA. We're going to shrink our footprint to match what we actually need here, while taking into account the fact that our actual customers are in rural America, which is not Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, Washington, D.C. has become one of the most expensive cities in the United States in which to live. Basically, we trail only the New York metropolitan area and places like San Francisco, California. And the government cannot afford, nor would it be wise, for us to pay 6-figure salaries to everybody. The taxpayer wouldn't stand for that. And so we need to be in locations where government salary can still make possible the American dream. That is to say, home ownership and a family and a yard. And with the cost of living in Washington, D.C. and the price of real estate, for far too many of our employees, if they want to own a home with a yard at an affordable price, they're looking at an hour plus commute one way every day. And while, when you're 20 or maybe your early 30s before you have before you're completely settled, that may be okay. We want people to stay with us for years because where we get the benefit is where people commit their time to the Department of Agriculture. They build up expertise and become truly international experts in the field of ag that they cover. And that's only possible if they're able to stay with us over the long term. And based on the cost structure here in Washington, D.C. and what it costs to live, all too frequently what this cost structure incentivizes is you come to USDA or some other federal cabinet agency for that matter, stay a few years, gain a little bit of experience, and then leave. And that structure isn't necessarily the best for the expertise we need to build up in the federal cabinet agency. And we've got to structure our footprint and our employee locations in a way where we can make long-term employees viable. Just to put a cherry on top of this, I just recorded a video yesterday, Dave, for an employee who is retiring at the end of this year, who has been with the Department of Agriculture, get this, 64 years.
Yeah.
64 years. That gentleman is in our research, education, and economics mission area. He has worked to help eradicate the boll weevil, which so destroyed cotton crops for centuries in this country. He is the reason why you don't hear about it anymore. Your younger listeners are like, what the heck is that? And Googling it right.
Yeah.
We want more people like that gentleman. And that gentleman did not work here in Washington, D.C. He's actually down in Mississippi. And so we need to be in places where I'm not saying everybody needs to stay 64 years. That is extraordinary. But I want them to stay with us 15 and 20 years or maybe more so that we can have the benefit of their experience. And that's increasingly difficult in an area where houses start at seven figures.
I have a couple more reorg questions for you, but as I'm listening to you, the one thing that strikes me, because you still can appreciate somebody who wants to own a home with a yard, right? And I'm curious what the transition was like for you personally going to DC the first time from compared to where you grew up, right? Like most people in DC don't have a yard or don't have much of a yard, right? So isn't that like culture shock? Like, what is it like for you personally these years? I know you've done it several years now, but isn't it weird? A weird change?
Well, to me, you're right. It's two sides of America, but it also helps me keep my head on straight. Because if you spend all your time in DC or New York, or perhaps some large cities on the West Coast, you would have the impression that what you have is normality.
Sure.
And that there's no other way to live. And then when I return home to rural Northwest Tennessee, there's a whole nother part of the country, and it happens to be the section of the country that USDA is charged with serving, that lives life quite differently. And so in order for me to do my job well, even here in Washington, D.C., I can't spend all my time here because I'd be part of that bubble you hear so much about. And I'd begin to think things and believe things that simply are untrue. And that would lead me to make ill-advised policy decisions. So it's actually been very critical, whether I was in the private practice of law or now that I'm in public service, for me to frequently be at my home in Union City, Tennessee, because it's the inputs that I receive there, or in a place, even a city like Memphis, or in other parts of the country that aren't huge metropolitan areas like we have here in the Northeast, that inform my thinking as to what the average citizen in this country is talking about and the problems that they have that need to be solved.
Can you get you said Memphis, can you get decent barbecue in DC?
Not really. Is the answer. It used to be a place called Hill Country. It was kind of more Texas flavored.
Okay.
But it had good barbecue, but it's closed. And so since they've closed, I haven't really ventured out barbecue around here. I save that for when I'm back in Memphis, and I'll get myself some ribs at the barbecue shop there on Madison Avenue, or perhaps if I'm wanting to stay downtown at Rendezvous there on Union.
Outstanding. Okay, so back to these five regional hubs. Will they all essentially serve the same purpose, or do they have some specialization built in by geography?
So our intent is not to have every agency at every hub. That wouldn't make too terribly much sense. It probably won't be a surprise to your listeners that our western hubs, that's where you're going to find more of a Forest Service presence because most of our Forest Service lands are west of the Mississippi. It makes little sense, quite frankly, now where all of our Forest Service leadership is across the street from me at the Yates Building. We don't have many national forests around here. Why shouldn't the Forest Service be closer to the land it manages? On the other hand, we picked these hub locations because some of our other agencies, like the Agricultural Research Service or the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, already have key locations there. They have found those locations helpful for the communities that they serve. And so we're building on infrastructure that we already have. And that's the second point I want to make. Each of these hub locations, one of the primary reasons we selected them, in addition to the cost of living, is because of the fact that we already have a footprint there. The taxpayers are already paying for leased office space there, in some cases owned. And in each of these locations, there are empty offices available for which the federal taxpayer is already paying and are setting unused. And so what we're doing is we're moving people from a footprint that has billions of dollars of backlog maintenance and is setting less than 40% occupied here in Washington, D.C. And we're moving it to newer, nicer spaces for which we're already paying and which we can bump up the use rate to 80, 90, or 100%. So we're not creating more assets and spending more taxpayer money to find new buildings. We're finding buildings we already have and filling them up to capacity while dumping $2 billion worth of liabilities that we have in the form of backlog maintenance here in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. It just makes good business sense.
Okay, so people have listened to this, and I think people are understanding this regionalization mindset. How do you assure folks that with the overall plan to pretty dramatically reduce the overall workforce, that folks who depend on the USDA services will still get that service that they have come to rely on? It'll be more efficient, it'll be delivered by fewer people, but at the end of the day, what we care about outside of the cost is that we can get our information and our questions answered. How do you assure that?
Well, we've spent a lot of time, Dave, talking about what is going to change. I think the answer to this question is found in what is not going to change, and that's our county office structure. Obviously, we're trying to shift more people into the field. Our county offices, whether it be our Farm Service Agency, our Rural Development, or Natural Resources Conservation Service, those county employees are exactly where we want them to be, serving our frontline customers in rural America. This reorganization plan will not affect any county office. Those county offices will remain where they are. The employees that are there will stay there. And perhaps equally as important, those county offices now will not have to reach up to Washington, D.C. for many matters. There'll be regional hubs much more closer to their location and certainly closer to rural America that if they have issues, they can bubble them up to where senior leaders will be who can handle the issue. Washington, D.C. doesn't have to be the be-all, end-all, but for our customers in rural America, the citizens whom we serve, those county offices are our core and they are untouched as part of this reorganization.
You still literally have one foot in the field since you've maintained your operations back home on the corn and bean side. As you know, corn and beans, especially in the Midwest where I am, those folks are unbelievable in production. Right now, need a lot more customers, to make this super generic here. The administration recently approved the $12 billion aid package to help some of these folks get through to next year, this bridge payment. As you assess the overall economic situation for a lot of our farmers, how do you see it?
It's supply and demand, like most things in economics. We have ever increasing supplies because of the ever increasing efficiency of our customers. And we need new markets, both overseas and domestically. So what's good about the third and fourth quarter of this year are the additional trade agreements the president has signed. Everyone's focused on China, and I get it. They're definitely the biggest dog in the room. But I encourage people to look at every other country but China. We've signed new frameworks with Japan, with Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, to which we basically never sold before, and countries in our own hemisphere, Central and South America. This represents new demand. And the barriers that are being broken down with these countries, which are not all tariff barriers, represent the ability to make new sales. This is going to begin to make a difference. But domestically, we need to keep in mind that we need to increase our consumption here in the United States. And the best way to do that for our largest commodity crops, corn and soy, is biofuels. We need E15 in this country. We need to have synthetic aviation fuel begin to be adopted by our airlines. We need to have the EPA, which has been a partner throughout the Trump administration, both term one and term two, finalize its proposed rule, increasing the renewable volume obligations, particularly for biodiesel. All of those will lead to significant increases in demand for our largest commodity crops, and all of that together should begin to turn the tide. You've already seen it a little in soy and in corn. We're having so far a record. Oh, we just cut out there.
You still got me?
Okay. As I was saying, we're seeing so far a record export pace in corn. That's showing up in the prices. I mean, I keep track of them every day. And you have seen them rise by a noticeable percentage amount as the market takes in the fact that, gee, American corn is really competitive and a lot more people are buying it at a higher rate than they typically do. Similarly, the fact that we now have a trade policy. For the prior 4 years, it was a policy of the previous administration, no new trade agreements. Not just, different types of trade agreements that President Trump might sign. They would not do a single trade agreement. And so when you looked at the price of soybeans prior to the signing of these recent agreements in 2025 and compared them to what they were in 2024, there was essentially no difference. Since the signing of these agreements, you have seen a pop in the price of soy that has been maintained. And as has been reported, the Chinese are keeping their commitments. We're now over the 3 million metric ton in terms of how much they have purchased. They are on track to meet the 12 million metric ton amount for this crop year. And then the next 3 crop years, they've made a minimum 25 million metric ton commitment. This is real demand that the market can depend on, and it's beginning to reflect on the price. But we can't forget that there's a other side to the balance sheet, and that's costs. And just before coming on to speak with you, Dave, I was having conversations with colleagues across the government about what we can do to bring down the cost of production here in this country. For our specialty crop friends, we have to thank the Department of Labor for its interim final rule to change the adverse effect wage rate. That is going to have a double-digit percentage effect in terms of bringing down the cost of production for specialty crops. For our larger commodity crops, we're focusing on fertilizer and equipment costs, as well as seed and chemicals. Each of these has seen a dramatic run-up over the past 5 years at a time when commodity prices have decidedly not matched that run-up. And there are legitimate questions to be asked of a legal nature, given some of the business decisions the fertilizer companies and the equipment manufacturers have made. And all of those decisions have given them more pricing power and reduced competition. I'm so glad the president has signed a couple of executive orders asking the Department of Justice to look into the ag input supply chain and root out any illegality that's gone on there. And USDA, including myself personally as Deputy Secretary, will be having discussions with DOJ in order to point them at where they need to look to ask the tough questions to ensure that farmers are getting a fair deal and not a raw deal whenever they go out to purchase the inputs they need to grow the food that feeds us all.
I have kind of a deep one, and I don't know if this is fair or unfair, but I'm thinking about your background in corn and soy. I appreciate that you have faith in the president. You worked for the guy twice, so clearly you like the guy and believe in him and believe that he will expand some of these foreign markets. And you've already laid out some of the things that it would take for us to increase our consumption domestically. As you sort of look at the future, are those two things enough? And I think standing here in the Midwest, I'm really thinking about corn and soy, truthfully, but we're just so good at growing so much of this stuff, right? Like, do you think it's going to be a sustainable path for these folks longer term, or are we going to have some of them kind of segue into something else? Is that fair?
It is a very fair question to ask because ultimately it gets down to supply and demand. And when I talk to commodity groups, more than just corn and soy, there has been so much focus on China, they're looking at the wrong country in a way, Dave. The country they should be talking about, the country that has changed the dynamics of the market internationally, is Brazil. If you take the growth in Brazilian production out, in corn and soy, but also in sugar, also in cotton, also in so many of the crops that we want to sell internationally, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Brazil is the delta that has changed the supply and put American ag producers in a heated competition. And I feel that the constant focus of so many of commodity groups, as well as the general news media, on China is hiding the ball. China would not have the choice of supplier it has were it not for Brazil. And that's why I am so grateful that our trade representative, who appeared in my courtroom when I was a federal judge at the Court of International,
Oh, yeah.
Jameson Greer, he's focused on Brazil. He's doing a Section 301 investigation to look at the unfair competition that our producers face. We're losing ag land here, as you know, Dave. It's being sold off for development, whether it be housing or whether it be commercial. In Brazil, they're gaining an agricultural footprint. And how are they doing so? By literally burning down the Amazon rainforest. We don't do that here. We would never do that here. And yet our farmers are competing against people who are expanding their footprint by burning down one of the greatest treasures ecologically across the world and expanding their production that way. It's about time that people join Jameson Greer in taking Brazil seriously and taking their China blinders off and realizing that long term, the question that you have asked, the answer to whether or not we are going to have a complete readjustment of our farm economy to meet the supply and demand model will not be answered by how we treat China. It will be answered by how we compete with Brazil. And that is what our focus needs to be on.
So how do we do that? How do we monitor and make sure a foreign country is doing things fairly?
Well, we need to, first of all, cause the rest of the Western world to live up to the rhetoric that they spout so freely at the United States. We are repeatedly deemed by our European Union partners and others on environmental grounds. The United States has had the greatest reforestation of any country in the world. When we founded this country, our forebears cut down a lot of trees, particularly in the Northeast. Those trees have regrown. I'm not much on carbon scores, but if you care about such things, we've actually taken more carbon out of the atmosphere than the European Union. And the reason why we have isn't because we're all driving around in electric vehicles. It's because we've allowed reforestation. Meanwhile, Brazil is burning down the Amazon rainforest. Not an exaggeration. So if you are buying an agricultural product from Brazil out of one side of your mouth, and out of the other side of your mouth, you're spouting all the latest environmental babble, I don't want to hear from you. You're a hypocrite and a liar. Live your values. If you truly believe that in environmentalism, you ought to be buying from an American farmer because we're not burning down anything in order to produce what we have here. And we are focused on getting the most food from the least amount of land possible, which is both efficient and, if you care about environmental values, the best for the environment. We need to aggressively point that out. We do not need to hide what our competitors are doing or focus the ball on China instead of Brazil. Brazil is the reason for so many of our commodity crops that they are in the position that they are in with declining prices. We're not competing on an even playing field, and we need to go out and make certain everyone around the world knows that if what you buy is American, you have the safest, most plentiful, most efficiently raised food supply the world has ever seen. And if you are buying from Brazil, you are subsidizing the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and you don't have those same guarantees that we can make about the safety of our food supply. And I think that's got to be our focus, and we shouldn't be shy about saying so.
Thank you. Appreciate the perspective, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dave. Really enjoyed it.
The USDA has heard criticisms that some employees do not want to move their families to other parts of the country and that services for farmers could suffer. We will address those complaints as part of our profile piece about the Deputy Secretary. You can find that in the free weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news. You can head there right now, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for supporting the podcast, and if you would, please share it with others so they can join us each week. And thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.